It was the summer of 1967 in Kowloon, Hong Kong. 7 men had gathered in a narrow training hall tucked between alleyways, their eyes fixed on a figure they believed to be untouchable. Bruce Lee never spoke of what followed that afternoon. By the time the last movement ended, one man was lying sprawled on the floor, dazed, and another was gripping his ribs as though his chest might never heal. The witnesses, 3 of them barely adults, later admitted they were shaken, not by the outcome, but by the method. What they had seen changed how they understood him. And yet, none could describe exactly how he had done it. The hall smelled of sweat and liniment, the air was thick with anticipation and fear. Something had happened there that would not appear in newspapers or magazines. It was private. Dangerous. And it left a trace on everyone who saw it. It was July 1967, in the dense urban sprawl of Kowloon, Hong Kong. The air was thick with humidity and the lingering smell of coal smoke from nearby factories. Bruce Lee, at 27, had begun to make a name for himself among martial arts circles in Hong Kong, though his reputation remained polarizing. To many, he was a showman, a man whose speed and fluidity were impressive but theoretical, untested against true, experienced fighters. To others, he represented a new paradigm, a departure from the rigid, lineage-bound forms that dominated the region. On the streets and in small dojos, debates over Bruce's legitimacy were common. Some masters whispered that his Jeet Kune Do approach, breaking down techniques into efficiency and adaptability, was dangerous, almost heretical. He moves like water, but water can drown you, one instructor confided to a witness decades later, referring to the very qualities that made Bruce unpredictable. Yet, in a culture that valued formal rank and tangible victories, whispers were not enough. He needed proof. This challenge was not a spectacle for cinema cameras or magazine photographers, it was an unrecorded test of skill against raw physical power. Bruce's aim was not fame, it was validation. Every movement, every strike, had to be deliberate, measurable, and ultimately survivable. The stakes were both external and internal. Failure could permanently damage his credibility among peers. Success could alter how martial artists viewed combat itself, shifting the conversation from tradition-bound technique to applied, functional precision. A semi-named witness, Mr. Lee Wykit, a small-time instructor and observer of the event, later recalled the anticipation. There was a quiet tension in the air, he said. We all knew this wasn't a show. Bruce was respected, yes, but respected differently. People feared him, not because he was arrogant, but because we couldn't predict him. Wykit's recollection highlights the psychological weight surrounding the event. Bruce's reputation for speed and unconventional methods made every move an emotional gamble for those watching. Physically, Bruce had spent years refining his body into a weapon tuned to precision. His lean, wiry frame belied explosive power, small, rapid strikes could destabilize a larger opponent. Yet even he understood the risks. One miscalculation against a genuine heavyweight could result in broken bones, or worse. That understanding of vulnerability was central to the event. Bruce was not invincible, and the tension between human fragility and technical mastery would shape the confrontation. By setting this stage, the cramped, humid streets of Kowloon, the controversial reputation he carried, and the private, high-stakes nature of the challenge, the groundwork for the conflict was laid. The psychological tension was as thick as the physical one. Bruce faced not only a larger, dangerous opponent but also the weight of proving the practical reality of his approach to martial arts. Witnesses sensed this dual pressure immediately. You could feel it in the room, Wykit added. It wasn't just a fight. It was a test of what it meant to move, to strike, and to survive without losing control. The summer of 1967 would mark more than a single afternoon in Kowloon. It would quietly set a precedent for what Bruce Lee considered possible, and what the martial arts world would only begin to recognize years later. And yet, at that moment, none of the witnesses fully understood the magnitude of what they were about to see. They were standing at the threshold of a confrontation that would challenge the limits of speed, control, and human decision-making in combat. The man waiting across the narrow hall from Bruce Lee was not a novelty or a hired spectacle. He was Chan Pak Lung, though in later recollections witnesses softened the name for discretion. Pak Lung was 28, standing at nearly 6 feet and weighing over 260 pounds of dense, trained muscle. His frame was broad, with shoulders that seemed to fill the low ceiling of the hall, and arms like coiled springs, capable of generating explosive force in a single swing. This was a man whose reputation in underground boxing and local street bouts preceded him, not through newspapers, but through whispered accounts of broken hands, fractured ribs, and opponents who never rose again from improvised rings. Witnesses described Pak Lung as calm but imposing. There was no overt showmanship, no theatrical posturing. His eyes, dark and unblinking, scanned Bruce with measured calculation. He didn't glance nervously, nor did he smirk, recalled Lee Wykit, the semi-named instructor present that afternoon. He simply observed. You could feel that every movement of his body was purposeful, as if he had rehearsed every possible reaction 100 times before. This presence, controlled, dangerous, credible, was precisely why Bruce treated the encounter with gravity. This was no demonstration for spectators, this was combat in its purest, unscripted form. Pak Lung's fighting style was rooted in traditional southern Chinese arts, fused with the mechanics of boxing. His punches were compact but heavy, capable of sending men off balance with a single blow. His stance was low and wide, legs coiled to spring, torso rigid yet flexible, ready to absorb or redirect force. Unlike the practitioners who adhered strictly to form, he had tested his techniques in real, uncontrolled confrontations. Bruce recognized immediately that size and strength would be Pak Lung's greatest advantage, but also a vulnerability if leveraged correctly. This was no casual sparring match. Both men understood the stakes, a single misstep could break bones, cut ribs, or force a humiliating retreat. Pak Lung was credible because he had survived, and thrived, in confrontations where instinct often outweighed etiquette. Every motion he made carried potential for significant damage. Observers later remarked that there was a subtle rhythm to his movements, a cadence born of experience, the shifting of weight, the tiny step to close distance, the flex of his fists. Bruce had faced skilled opponents before, but rarely someone whose presence alone carried the silent promise of destruction. Psychologically, Pak Lung posed a dual challenge. He was not only a physical threat but also a mental one. His calm, almost detached demeanor tested Bruce's composure before any strike was thrown. There was an unspoken tension. Could Bruce impose his unconventional method on raw, hardened power without letting his own judgment slip? Could he maintain control when facing a man who was both fearless and seasoned in the brutal reality of street combat? The hall itself amplified the challenge. With ceilings just above head height and walls close enough to constrain lateral movement, any error in Pak Lung's favor would be immediately punishing. Witnesses recalled that the atmosphere was thick with anticipation, sweat gathered on brows, and the faint scent of liniment and wooden floors heightened sensory awareness. Every twitch, every shift in stance, became magnified under the scrutiny of Bruce's trained eyes. In that confined space, Bruce Lee faced not a theoretical opponent but a tangible, formidable presence, a man of size, experience, and lethal intent. Pak Lung's credibility lay not in spectacle but in the quiet, almost clinical readiness to exploit weakness. And as Bruce sized him up, the weight of real danger settled like a stone in the pit of his stomach, forcing him to confront his own limitations and to prepare for a confrontation where skill alone would not guarantee survival. The hall in which Bruce Lee and Chan Pak Lung would face each other was unremarkable to the casual observer, a long, narrow room tucked between two brick buildings in Kowloon. The ceiling was low, roughly 7 feet, forcing taller men to keep shoulders slightly hunched. Wooden floorboards, worn smooth by decades of practice, creaked and groaned under even the lightest shift of weight. Dust hung faintly in the air, disturbed by each step, and the smell of sweat and liniment, rubbing oils used to warm muscles, permeated every corner. This was no arena, it was an intimate crucible, where the physical and psychological stakes would press against every inch of space. There were no formal rules. No rounds. No gloves. No referees. Bruce and Pak Lung understood that the confrontation would be defined by instinct, skill, and control. A single poorly timed punch could snap ribs or sever cartilage, a misjudged step could send one man sprawling into the wall. The lack of structure heightened tension for both fighters and witnesses alike. Every movement required calculation, hesitation could be costly. The private nature of the fight also removed any external accountability. What occurred within these walls would remain unspoken beyond the three witnesses and the two participants. The witnesses themselves were semi-named figures in local circles, recruited by Bruce's acquaintances to ensure some measure of observation. Lee Wykett, already familiar to the martial arts community, recalled feeling the oppressive weight of anticipation. "We weren't spectators," he said. "We were alive in it. Every step they took was deliberate. Every pause felt like the calm before a storm." Two other observers, barely adults at the time, maintained wide-eyed vigilance, ready to intervene only if catastrophe threatened. Their presence was silent but palpable, adding to the emotional charge in the room. Bruce understood that the hall's dimensions would constrain mobility, making precise positioning essential. He could not rely on sweeping, expansive movements. Power had to be transferred efficiently through compact strikes. Pak Lung, aware of the spatial limitations, adjusted his stance, lowering his center of gravity and keeping elbows close to the torso to absorb potential blows. Every gesture carried weight, the subtle pivot of a foot, the flex of a forearm, even a slight lean of the torso could signal an opening or a trap. The psychological atmosphere was as thick as the physical. Both men recognized the stakes: control versus raw power, precision versus size, method versus instinct. Bruce's breathing was deliberate, measured, but even he could feel the tension pressing on his shoulders. The witnesses described it as almost tactile, an energy in the air that made each heartbeat audible in their own ears. Pak Lung's calm presence amplified it. He did not overcommit, yet his potential for sudden, decisive force remained evident. The hall became a crucible not just for combat but for restraint, patience, and acute awareness. Emotionally, the hall was charged with moral weight. Bruce carried the knowledge that every strike could harm, perhaps permanently. Pak Lung, seasoned in the realities of violence, understood the danger yet also expected it. For the witnesses, the stakes were observation without interference, a test of courage in the face of controlled chaos. Even the ambient details, the dim light filtering through narrow windows, the creaking boards underfoot, the smell of sweat, contributed to a sensory intensity that heightened perception and sharpened reflexes. In those confined, unyielding conditions, the groundwork for confrontation was complete. The space, the rules, or absence of them, and the emotional tension combined to form an environment where every physical and mental choice carried immediate consequences. The stage was set. Bruce Lee and Chan Pak Lung were about to enter a physical dialogue in which precision, judgment, and restraint would determine not only victory but survival. The first contact between Bruce Lee and Chan Pak Lung was almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. There was no dramatic charge or flurry of punches. Instead, the initial moments were a study in measurement, distance, and anticipation. Bruce shifted his weight slightly, testing the range of Pak Lung's reach with subtle footwork. Each inch of space mattered. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath their movements, punctuating the rhythm of caution and calculation. Pak Lung made the first subtle motion, a slight lowering of his shoulders, a flex of his fists, but Bruce responded without hesitation. In one fluid step, he deflected a probing jab aimed at his midsection, not with brute force but by redirecting the energy along the line of the opponent's arm. Witness Lee Wykett later recalled, it was almost imperceptible. You couldn't tell if it was technique or instinct, but it immediately unsettled Pak Lung. That small, controlled movement forced the larger man to pause, testing both his patience and his understanding of Bruce's timing. The exchange escalated as Bruce initiated a controlled probing sequence. A quick, angled strike toward the shoulder tested Pak Lung's reaction time. The larger man absorbed it but responded with a low sweep, attempting to disrupt balance. Bruce anticipated it, adjusting his stance mid-motion, maintaining perfect center of gravity. The hall, narrow and constraining, amplified every movement, missteps could send a man into walls or boards, creating real danger. Each adjustment was immediate, precise, and born of experience. Bruce's mastery of leverage and biomechanics allowed him to exploit the slightly slower tempo of a heavier opponent. Witnesses described the psychological shift at this moment. Pak Lung, initially confident in his size and strength, began to hesitate. The weight of Bruce's precision contrasted sharply with his own raw force. It was as if the air itself had changed, Wykett said. The first strike didn't hurt him, but it made him question if he could predict Bruce at all. That hesitation was dangerous, it made him vulnerable. The tension in the room thickened, the larger man's instinctive confidence now competed against methodical control. Physically, Bruce's strikes were not about maximum power, they were calculated probes, each one testing openings while preserving his own balance. A jab to the ribs, angled precisely, caused Pak Lung to shift weight defensively. A flick of the wrist toward the chest measured reaction speed. Even his breathing, steady, controlled, deliberate, was part of the strategy, minimizing telegraphing and maintaining composure under stress. Every motion was observable, measurable, and purposeful. As the exchange continued, speed and control collided. Bruce's body moved with explosive economy, rapid, accurate strikes that created openings without overcommitting. Pak Lung's raw power forced Bruce to remain vigilant, adjusting constantly. Witnesses noted the subtle shifts, the tightening of Pak Lung's jaw, the micropauses in his movements, the way his eyes tracked Bruce's hands. For the first time, it was evident that physical size alone could not dominate a fight defined by timing, precision, and acute perception. The first exchange ended not with a decisive strike but with an unspoken acknowledgement. Bruce had established the rules of engagement, precision over force, strategy over brawn. Pak Lung's confidence had been challenged, yet the danger remained palpable. Both men stepped back slightly, sweat beginning to glisten under the dim light, muscles coiled and ready. The witnesses felt the room's tension spike, the fight had shifted from measured testing to something closer to inevitability. Bruce had demonstrated that his method worked in the first critical seconds, but the stakes were escalating. The calm, measured probing of the first exchange gave way to an unmistakable shift. The confined hall seemed smaller now, every movement carrying potential consequence. Bruce Lee and Chan Pak Lung had moved past testing, they were engaged in the first moments of a fight that could leave lasting damage. The air was thick with tension, the smell of sweat and liniment hung heavier, mingling with the metallic tang of blood from an early, grazing strike to Pak Lung's lip. Bruce initiated a forward sweep, stepping just enough to destabilize Pak Lung without overcommitting. His strike landed, not with overwhelming power, but with precise leverage that shifted the opponent's balance. Pak Lung's ribs cracked audibly against the resistance of a targeted elbow strike, an injury small in scope but impossible to ignore. The larger man staggered slightly, eyes narrowing, recognizing that Bruce's skill had turned his raw strength into a liability. Witness Lee Wykett later described the moment, it was clear Bruce could have ended it then. But he didn't. That pause, it wasn't hesitation, it was control. Pak Lung retaliated, attempting a heavy, looping strike aimed at Bruce's midsection. The hall's narrow dimensions amplified the danger, one misstep and either man could collide with a wall, splintering boards under their weight. Bruce shifted instinctively, twisting his body to absorb the impact with minimal damage. The energy of Pak Lung's blow rolled through his frame but found no purchase, leaving the larger man momentarily exposed. Bruce's eyes flickered with a subtle awareness of his own potential, a recognition of how lethal his techniques could be in full force. Psychologically, this was the turning point. Bruce felt the weight of responsibility pressing against his skill. He could strike decisively, potentially ending the confrontation permanently. Yet every fiber of his being reminded him of the human cost. Observers noted a momentary crack in his composure, a fleeting hesitation, the only one in the confrontation, revealing the tension between mastery and morality. He was aware of the consequences of overreach, the potential to inflict serious injury, and yet he was pressed by the opponent's power, the heat of the hall, and the stakes of validation. The witnesses were tense, frozen between admiration and fear. One recalled gripping a post, knuckles white, as Bruce executed a precise foot sweep, knocking Pak Lung off balance but carefully avoiding a full collapse. Another breathless moment followed a shoulder strike, delivered with speed that threatened harm yet stopped just short of permanent damage. The moral choice was as critical as the physical one. Bruce had the capacity to dominate, perhaps to destroy, but he chose measured control. Every movement demonstrated restraint, even as his body operated on instinctual efficiency. The hall seemed to pulse with the escalating danger. Pak Lung, bruised and slowed slightly by precise strikes, nevertheless remained formidable. His recovery was rapid, his gaze unbroken. Bruce recognized that the fight was not merely about proving skill but about testing limits, of himself, of his opponent, and of what he could control under pressure. Each strike, each shift in stance, carried psychological weight, both for Bruce and for those silently observing. By the end of the exchange, the stakes had grown beyond physical injury. Bruce's choices in those seconds, whether to dominate fully or maintain measured restraint, established the moral framework of the encounter. The witnesses would later recall that the fight's tension was defined not by who landed the hardest blow, but by the deliberate decisions Bruce made to regulate power, control potential destruction, and navigate the fine line between survival and ethical action. The confrontation had reached a point where skill, fear, and conscience intersected, a test not only of martial prowess but of character. And in that narrow hall in Kowloon, the lesson was unmistakable. True mastery lies as much in the decisions one refrains from taking as in the strikes one executes. The fight ended without a dramatic finale. There was no crowd cheering, no triumphant declaration, only the heavy, measured breathing of two men who had tested the limits of body and mind. Bruce Lee stepped back, his muscles still coiled, eyes scanning Pak Lung's stance for any residual threat. Pak Lung, battered but upright, adjusted his shoulders, taking stock of the bruising along his ribs and the split across his lip. The danger had been real, palpable, yet neither man had sought to destroy the other. Witnesses remembered the silence that followed. Lee Wai-kit recalled gripping a floorboard as if the tension itself could splinter it. No one moved for a long moment, he said. We all understood what had happened without words. Bruce could have ended it, but he chose control. And Pak Lung, he respected that. The emotional weight of restraint hung as heavily as the sweat in the air. Those few seconds of silence crystallized the moral and psychological stakes. Mastery was not measured by destruction but by the disciplined application of force. Long-term consequences rippled quietly through both men's lives. For Bruce, the encounter validated his philosophy in ways public demonstrations never could. He saw the truth of his approach: precision, speed, and awareness could neutralize raw power, but also the burden it carried. A single misjudged strike might have resulted in serious injury. The fight reinforced his belief that martial skill must be tempered by moral judgment, a lesson he carried forward in teaching, choreography, and personal reflection. Pak Lung, too, emerged with a renewed understanding of the limitations of size and power. The experience forced him to reckon with the fact that strength alone could not guarantee dominance. Witnesses reported that he later modified his training, incorporating more agility and awareness, acknowledging, at least tacitly, that Bruce's methodical efficiency had exposed vulnerabilities in his approach. For the witnesses, the encounter left a lasting imprint. They remembered the small, precise motions, the shifting balance, the subtle adjustments of stance and angle. They remembered the human tension in Bruce's hesitation, the moral choice embedded in every strike. In interviews decades later, Wai-kit would describe it not as a fight, but as a lesson in controlled responsibility. The strongest man in the room is not the one who wins, he said, it's the one who knows exactly how much damage he chooses not to do. The hall itself, narrow and dusty, remained a silent witness to the confrontation. Its worn boards had absorbed footsteps, weight shifts, and the echo of controlled strikes. The event would never appear in newspapers, films, or promotional materials. Its significance existed only in memory, in testimony, and in the subtle shift of martial understanding it prompted among those present. Bruce's philosophy, validated in the crucible of confined space and genuine danger, gained a quiet legitimacy that would later influence countless students and observers. In retrospect, the afternoon in Kowloon was more than a demonstration of technique, it was an exploration of human limits, ethical choices, and the delicate balance between power and restraint. Bruce Lee emerged both tested and tempered, his reputation for precision and intelligence reinforced. The witnesses, too, left changed. They had observed not merely a fight, but a disciplined confrontation with risk, mortality, and moral consequence. And as the room emptied and the men departed, one thought lingered: true mastery is measured not in victory or defeat, but in the conscious restraint exercised at the moment one could inflict the greatest harm. The lesson was quiet, unheralded, yet unforgettable.